Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and today I'm going to show you how I made this custom built bookshelf for my new apartment. Let's get started. When we moved into our new apartment and set it all up, we knew that we would need some extra storage in the living room space. And if you watched my video last week on the living room makeover in our new apartment, you will see that I custom made a metal and wood shelf for that purpose. Now, one thing I want to mention is that if you do not have a welder in your workshop, you can very easily swap out the metal legs for wood ones, and I will walk you through that in a little while. But before I get ahead of myself, let's start at the very beginning. So I used 2x6 boards from my local Home Depot for this project, and I began by cutting all of the round edges off of the board and cutting the boards down to their final width. Specifically, I cut 3 pieces for the top shelf at 5 inches wide, and then cut 3 pieces for the middle shelf and 3 pieces for the bottom shelf at 4 inches wide. But if you're looking for all the specific measurements for this entire build, you can find them on the post that I made for this build on my website by clicking on the link below this video. After ripping all of the pieces to their final width, I began to laminate them together using some wood glue. Now, if you're looking for a faster way to do this, you can use pocket hole joinery or something equivalent. For me, I knew that I really wanted to just laminate these pieces together and have no joinery showing, so I just did it this way. The only thing that kind of stunk about doing it this way is that I did have to wait a couple of days for each one to dry because I am very limited on floor space in my workshop, and I'm also very limited on really long clamps. Also, don't judge me, I was clearly very limited on paint roller covers as well to use for this paint roller, and I had to get a little crafty. But sometimes you just gotta get creative with what you have, and that's what I did, and it worked just fine. So after spreading the glue pretty evenly across the boards, I then clamped them all together, making sure that they were nice and flush, and then I left these boards to dry overnight. So ultimately, it did pretty much take me 3 days to finish gluing all 3 of these panels together, but all is well because as they dried, I then worked on some other parts of the project, such as the legs. So because I'm basically a hoarder, I actually still have leftover pieces of 1.5-inch square tubing from when I built my parents their dining room table last summer, so I decided to use the leftover pieces to create the legs for this bookshelf. Now, like I mentioned earlier, if you don't want to do metalwork for this project, you can really easily swap out these metal legs for 2x2 lumber that you can purchase at your local home improvement store. And since 2x2 lumber is essentially the same size as 1.5-inch square tubing, all of the dimensions that I have on my website will very easily match up, so you can definitely make the same project as mine using wood legs instead of metal legs and use the same dimensions that I did. So let's talk about my obsession with circular saws here for a second. So as part of Home Depot's Prospective program this year, I got my hands on 2 different Milwaukee circular saws. And now I'm super stoked about this because now that I'm getting into metalworking, I do like keeping a metal cutting blade on one of my circular saws and then keeping a wood cutting blade on a second circular saw. That way I have easy access to both types of blades when I'm cutting metal and wood projects. But as you can see, I did use my circular saw to cut all of the metal pieces that I needed for the bookshelf, and that included the legs as well as the shelf brackets. Once all of the metal pieces were cut, it was time to start the welding process, so I pulled out my folding welding table from storage and set it up on a concrete pad outside of my workshop. Now, if you've never welded before, something that you definitely have to do is clean the metal before welding it, and I did this using an angle grinder. And if you're interested to learn a little bit more about this, I do have a very small introduction to welding story in my Instagram highlights that you can check out and watch to learn a little bit more about the process. And once all of the metal was cleaned up in the spots that I wanted to weld, it was then time to begin the welding process. To make my life easier, I actually did all of the metal work and welding while I was waiting for the shelf pieces to dry because that allowed me to then do work on the shelf pieces while the metalworking and paint dried later. But either way, before jumping into the welding process, it was definitely really important for me to make sure that everything was nice and square and straight because it is not the easiest to fix crooked metalwork once everything is welded together. Trust me, I've learned the hard way too many times at this point. I definitely spent a lot of time here measuring and making sure things were straight, and honestly, it definitely helped to have magnetic accessories around like my new Milwaukee tape measure as well as those magnetic clamps. But after I was finally happy with the way that everything was laid out, it was time to start the welding process. And I have a really simple Lincoln electric welder that is a plug and go. You literally just plug it into an outlet, plug in whatever the material is that you are using, as well as the gauge of the metal, and then it automatically sets all of the settings up for you and you can just go ahead and weld. I know that I introduced this process to you guys last year on the channel with the dining room build, but let me know if this is something that you're more interested in learning about, because I'd be more than happy to do an intro to welding video on my channel for anyone who wants one. But in the meantime, back to the build. As you can see, I did tack my pieces into place and then double, triple, quadruple check square to make sure everything was good. And then once everything was nice and square, I then used my welder to weld everything into place permanently. Now, while at this point in my welding career, I can confidently say that my welds are nice and strong, they are still not the prettiest welds in the entire world. So to help with this, I use my angle grinder to grind down the welds to make them look really nice, before giving the entire piece a nice light once over with the polishing disc to prep it for primer and for paint. But before I could get ahead of myself, I did have to cut some metal pieces that were going to be able to attach these legs I made to the wood. So I did this by cutting some flat bar with my circular saw and a metal cutting blade to weld to the top of each one of these legs. Now, if you're using wood instead of metal, you can skip this step because you'll be able to attach the shelf pieces to the legs without a bracket, but you can find all the details for that on my website. In the meantime, for my own build, I did have to prep this metal the same exact way that I did with the rest of the steel. I gave it a really nice cleaning using the angle grinder, and then I welded it to the actual leg pieces, again checking for square like 6,000 times before welding it into place permanently. Now, after I was finished welding, it was time to finish up these legs, and I started by spraying them with a metal primer and then moved on to using a black spray enamel to finish them off. Ideally, I would have loved to powder coat these legs, but I don't have the DIY capacity to do so, and this worked perfectly. Now, one thing I forgot to do before I started painting these legs, which made my life very difficult, was I forgot to insert holes or openings into the flat bar, because this is where I'm going to be attaching the top shelf to the bars. So to do this, I just measured where I wanted these holes to be drilled, and I drilled them using metal-specific drill bits as well as some lubricant to keep the drill bits from overheating. I then wiped away any of the excess metal shavings and then set aside the legs to use them later, because now I was going to turn my focus to working on the shelves. So after days of waiting for different variations of shelving pieces to dry in my workshop, I was finally able to prepare these shelving pieces for their final finishing stages. Luckily, 2 of the shelves were able to fit through my surface planer, but one of them wasn't. So to help take care of the first 2 shelves first, I called in some extra help from my dad because these things were heavy.
Ew.
Atlas, why'd you have to poop right when we're working? All right, so you're on deck.
No.
I'm gonna feed it through, and then you just have to kind of guide it back.
Nope.
Why are you throwing rocks in?
I have to. Someone has to throw something at you.
I was so stoked to have my dad help with this because these things were not only really heavy but could not fit in my workshop, so it was really helpful to have him on the other end to pull on the boards while I fed them through the planer. But ultimately, once I was done taking advantage of his free labor, I then brought the boards back into my workshop where I cut them down to their final size using my other circular saw with the wood cutting blade as well as a straight edge. And I made sure to do this with all 3 shelves before moving on to, obviously, my favorite part of any project. Oh, now it's time for more sanding. I don't want to sand this thing. I'm not looking forward to this. Fine. Fine, I'll do it. Fine. You win. Now, if you've been subscribed to me for a while, you will know that I very often have a brat attack when it is time to sand, but this project in particular was really not fun to sand because the top shelf could not fit through the planer, which meant that I had to flatten the entire thing using my belt sander. Luckily, though, we were going for a little bit of a more rustic look on these bookshelves, so I didn't have to sand it perfectly, but I definitely tried my best to flatten it as best as I could using my sander. And since these boards were rough to begin with, I also used some hand sanding to get into some of the nooks and crannies that could possibly give splinters, and I don't want splinters in my home. Now, after initially sanding all of the boards to about 120 grit, I then went in with a tinted wood putty to fill in any of the major gaps in between each of the seams. And once that wood putty dried, I final sanded all of the shelves down to 220 grit. In keeping with the rustic theme of this bookshelf, I decided to use a wood accelerator instead of a stain, and basically this makes the wood look like aged barn wood and that it's been left out in the elements for years. I just followed the instructions that were on the can for this particular product, allowed everything to dry, and then the next day I was able to begin installing the legs onto the bookshelf. At this point, I wasn't so concerned about permanently attaching the middle shelf or the bottom shelf because these shelves are really heavy, but instead I only focused on attaching the legs to the top shelf using the holes that I drilled in the brackets. So 95.5 divided by 2, go.
47.75.
So after some simple maths with my brother, I figured out where exactly I wanted everything to go and began to mark holes for where I was going to pre-drill openings for the threaded inserts to go into. We also made sure to run a dry fit of all of the shelves to make sure that everything lined up perfectly and was square before drilling into the top shelf. I then made any last-minute adjustments before bribing my brother with pizza to help me finish this build.
I wonder if
Try to do that.
we have any pizza left in the fridge.
Ooh, I could do pizza. After being happy with the placement, we worked together to remove the shelf pieces from the legs, and then I began to pre-drill holes for the threaded inserts to attach the legs to the top shelf. Now, the reason that I opted for threaded inserts for this build is because threaded inserts will allow me to take this shelf apart and put it back together as many times as I need to, which is really helpful for moving big pieces of furniture in and out of spaces. Luckily, I just got my hands on a new drill along with some corresponding drill bits, and I was able to pick the perfect drill bit that I needed in order to install the threaded inserts correctly. I basically just drilled my pilot holes and then installed the threaded inserts directly into those holes using a little bit of CA glue so that they don't pop out. And once the inserts were in place, it was time to put the legs back on the shelf and screw them into place for its final fit before moving it into the apartment. And once the legs were in place and I was happy, the last step was to install some plastic stoppers into the bottom of the tubing. Now, before actually installing this thing into our apartment, I did want to make sure that it would be weight bearing, and so I decided to give it a weight test by obviously laying on it, because what else would I do? And once I figured out that it would hold my weight, I was confident it would hold the weight of some of the things that I was putting on it, and so I ran a final fit to make sure that everything was square and stable before taking it apart all over again and then bribing my brother yet again to help me move this thing into my apartment. And of course, this wouldn't be a DIY Huntress project if I didn't preach about labeling pieces, so I definitely made sure to label everything before taking it apart to move into the apartment because I didn't want to mistake any legs with the wrong openings and run into issues when installing later. But once I was done labeling everything, I then began to take all of the legs off of the top shelf and then put those in my car and then stacked all of the wood in my car as well because it was time to install the shelving unit in my new apartment. Now, because this thing was so heavy and bulky, I definitely enlisted the help of my brother. Like I said, it only cost me a slice of pizza, so I'll take it. But we basically worked together to carry all of the pieces into the apartment where we assembled everything in place. Honestly, threaded inserts for the win because there is no way that we would have been able to install this piece in its entirety. It definitely had to be taken apart and put back together. Should we go get something to eat?
Yeah, I'm down.
Okay. One of my favorite things about building and designing furniture is custom making it for a special space. And now that we have a new apartment, I cannot wait to continue making new pieces for our new place. I could not be happier with the way that this bookshelf or our new living room turned out in the end. I really am just so excited to have a place to display older memories while making new memories in our new place. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this project. I know that it's been a little while since I've put out a furniture build, but I'm super stoked on it and I hope you're super stoked on it. And I'm dead serious about being excited about making more furniture for this space. I have so many things planned and I cannot wait to share them. If you guys haven't had a chance yet, definitely make sure to check out my apartment living room makeover situation on my YouTube channel. I posted that video last week. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this project, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. But until next time, friends, thank you so much for watching, for all of the love and support, and I will see you soon with another video. But until then, friends, happy DIYing.